Stay with us now as tonight's New Music Los Angeles program continues.
A number of us, a number of composers, and certainly both Pierre and myself, around the time of the war, of the Second War, were very concerned with exploring and elaborating the field of rhythm in a way that had not been done by Stravinsky and Schoenberg, and carrying on many of the things they did to a greater and more elaborate extent. And I must say that I thought at that time that I was doing something like Descartes did in making graphs of algebraic equations. We're taking irregular rhythms with the Stravinsky and the types of expressive things that Schoenberg did, and making regular beats of various speeds combined together to produce all sorts of irregularities. And this was the way I thought of developing this. There was a similar kind of thing in a good friend of mine, Conlon Nancarrow. We were both doing that back in the early 40s, and my music has been from that time on very concerned with all sorts of ways of expanding the field of rhythm. One of the kinds of things that was people were very concerned with in the 19th century was the notion of the upbeat. And I must say my teacher, Nadia Boulanger, always used to say that in a Bach work, the upbeat starts after the first note. The first note is the downbeat of the measure, and then all the rest is the upbeat to the next one. It used to make us rather angry, but it was a thought of the upbeat and of the various qualities of beat and how they relate together is something I've been thinking a great deal about.
I did not know you at this time. I mean, that was 1944, 1945, right. 40 years ago, my God, long ago. So when I was still in the Conservatoire in Paris, and we had Messiaen as a teacher, and Messiaen was very involved in discovering, because I mean, not only our tradition, let's say the plain chant tradition, with the gnomes and things like that. How do you pronounce it?
Gnomes.
But also he was very interested in other civilizations, especially the civilization of India. He had read books. He was never there. I mean, but he read books on the music of India, and he was really quite knowledgeable and very knowledgeable on these rhythmical theories in Indian music. But anyway, it was very impressive. I remember music from Bali, music from India, music from Japan, from China, and also recordings which were done by the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, which is the anthropology museum. And I knew the director of this museum, and I heard quite a lot of recordings he did in Africa, especially. Personally, it was no commercial recordings for this one. And I thought, of our tradition, which is so poor from the rhythmical point of view, and which considered always the rhythm as something natural. And in the early ages of our tradition, in the 14th century, 15th century, the rhythm was not something natural, but something very elaborate. And if you see the Ars Nova, especially, it was really extremely complex, and even so complex that you have no idea now how complex it was, and you barely imagine now how this music could be performed accurately, with canons in different time and so on and so forth, and without score. So I have asked sometimes musicologists, how could they perform it? We don't know. That was the only answer, because it is really complex. So this kind of tradition disappeared, not quite in the 16th century, when you had still the Renaissance with the antique meters, which were done with in madrigals of the Renaissance time. And then after, in the 17th century, there was a kind of drop. Rhythm was mainly tied to dances. And from the Baroque age until the beginning of the 20th century, rhythm was considered just natural. And certainly, the Stravinsky and Bartók were coming from another tradition, and they brought us some vitality which was no more in the kind of cultural tradition of the West. And from this point, the rhythm began again to be something quite individual, and not only a category which was going with everything, but an individual category which has to be looked for itself. You could conceive a rhythmical scheme before conceiving another scheme of pitches, for instance, which would have been absolutely impossible before. So progressively, the rhythm developed in a way which was absolutely unforeseeable only 50 years ago, I suppose. And then also, for me, I must have a confession. I discovered Elliott rather late in my life. Well, not so late, but I mean, what attracted me first, that was this rhythmical vitality and the rhythmical research we were doing, which were quite different of all what we did in Europe, also after Messiaen, after Stravinsky. And for me, that was really something very important to discover what you did, especially with the speed, the change of speed, because always in the Messiaen or in the Stravinsky tradition, or even with this influence non-European tradition, that was always a kind of rhythm depending from one unit, but the unit was not changing.
A very fast unit, usually.
Yes, a very fast unit.
16th note.
And what you developed, it appeared to me, it was obvious to me later, that's a kind of very, very, very big extrapolation of what Stravinsky did in Lenos, for instance.
Yeah.
Then Lenos, this kind of change of level of speed, then you did that also in a much elaborate way. And for me, that was a thing I have never seen among all the European musicians who were working at this time. So, I mean, also in my generation, let's say Stockhausen, who did quite a lot of things also on time. He wrote an article which is very famous, Wie die Zeit vergeht, in German, and it was an analysis of the conception of time in Gruppen. In this article, he also tied the universe of time with the universe of pitch very precisely. And also, it was for the first time done in this work, and it was very clear in this article that he was, let's say, he was preoccupied of bringing all categories together and not thinking them separately.
Yes. Well, actually, that had been done to a certain extent by our old Henry Cowell, who there's a book called Musical Resources, in which he attempts to combine rhythms with harmonies and various things by a number system. It always seemed to me that was rather artificial and didn't work very well. And actually, Conlon Nancarrow derived a lot of his ideas from Henry Cowell's. He studied with Henry Cowell here, I think, in California somewhere.
You haven't mentioned, however, the monorhythmic of Alban Berg and the kind of rhythmical weavings of Webern. Are they not also fairly sophisticated and subtle developments of what you've been talking about?
Yes, certainly. Also, I mean, Berg in the monorhythmica in both of his operas, Wozzeck and Lulu, and also in the Kammer Concert, you have a monorhythmica. So, I mean, in all these late works, you have always this preoccupation that the rhythm should be completely independent from the other organization, or could be considered independently from the other organization. And I find the most striking example of that, and I find still very striking, that's the scene in Wozzeck, which is after the death of Marie, when Wozzeck comes to the
bar, sort of
the bar, yes.
Yeah.
And
with the
Locale.
offstage band.
yes, no, with the piano.
Yeah.
There is a piano only, and you have the orchestra and the chorus, and everybody begins to speak very unnaturally, because there's a kind of nightmare scene when Wozzeck is discovered with the blood on his hands, and all the German text is put into music against all natural accentuation. The words are chopped, and this rhythm, this kind of nightmare rhythm, is invading the old musical text, and the text is chopped by these interferences of the rhythm. And that's very interesting to give this nightmare impression, this kind of uneasiness, this distortion of the language, with a very simple mean, just have interfere the rhythmical ideas with the text. And then, of course, as the two don't go well together, it gives you this impression of nightmare. And I find that's one of the most striking effects of rhythm with a text which exists in music.
You have said, Elliott Carter, that total serialism invades every dimension of the musical rhetoric and predictably produces disastrous results from any artistic standpoint in the vast majority of cases. Now, is there really such a thing as total serialism? And do you find the serialist works of a composer like Pierre Boulez disastrous? If not, why not?
Well, I don't think you're mentioning cases, not total serialism. You know, what I'm talking about in that particular thing was actually something that we were both at. I think it was in Rome in that ISCM festival in 1958, where they played where you conducted some of the early performances of the Improvisations. But there were other pieces on those programs that were sort of strict Darmstadt pieces, and I was ruminating on the idea that the pieces were so, in some sense, so predictably unpredictable because they'd been distorted by this non-numerical system, and also they had no communicative value. They were really totally uninteresting, except that they were surprising, that you couldn't really tell what was going to happen because people had never applied the number system in that particular way, so they were surprising once and then never again. But I don't think that the whole question of serialism is something much broader than that. I think that there have been very remarkable examples of works that are rather highly controlled serially. And I take back some of what I said. This was written quite a long time ago.
What I think now.
Yes, yes.
Well, I think I had to go through what I call after Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes called a book of his in the 1950s, exactly at the same time, 1952, I guess. He called it in French le degré zéro de l'écriture, which is, well, you know, degré zéro de l'écriture means when the writing is nothing. I mean, and when the level of writing does not count for anything. And I think, as I mean, people of my generation had to go through this leveling, through this tabula rasa of everything, because if we want to renovate the grammar of music, then, as I mean, you have to just go from nothing. And of course, to start from nothing, you have to have some rules, to establish some rules again. And these rules were, at the beginning, there was a kind of, not for long, but there was a kind of faith in the numerical order. And you think that if you are covered by numerical order, you will be good. And that's, of course, was not the case. The numbers were good, but the music was not good. Because if you apply that to each parameter, what applies to pitch doesn't apply to time, what applies to time does not apply to time, and so on and so forth. As I mean, having a kind of numerical law for everything was absurd. And then I was, after this tabula rasa, I think I was the first one to write first an article against this kind of generalization, and second I wrote Marteau, which I think is quite liberated from this numerical Aberglaube, how do you would say that?
Superstition.
Superstition, yes. So that's also long way back.
Yes, it is. It is a kind of Pythagorean, it's a kind of mystical thing, I think.
Yes.
On a certain level, that's its best side, perhaps, is this sort of mystical belief.
Mystical belief in numbers. Well, you know, you have various mystical beliefs. I remember also some music of Villa-Lobos, and he was trying to describe in his music the mountains of São Paulo or anything else, I mean, mountains anyway. And he thought it was very Brazilian to write melodies according to the shape of mountains. Well, we were writing non-melodies with shape of numbers, so, you know.
That's right.
Well, that brings you very naturally to John Cage, who scores...
Why, very naturally.
Well,
Be
I think you conducted Renga, didn't you?
Yes, I
and
did.
part of
And
that
that
score.
was I think, the best concert in my 7 years in New York.
Well.
The bar did a very good business.
But when you talk about a piece in the shape of mountains, what about all the thorough drawings that Cage asked the musicians to play? Actual drawings.
Yes, actual drawings by thorough, that's true, yes. And they were not thorough musicians. Let's make it fun. But I mean, what could I say? I mean, when you have a group of 50 musicians and you see a part of a leaf only, and you see a small thing, or a fish, or a boat, and I say, well, you see, there is a line like that, make a small glissando up, and when there was a boat, I say, make a chord approximately on the same level. And that's it. And so you have to give kind of inspiration to everybody, which is sometimes quite hard.
It must have been a Boulez piece in the end by the time you got
That
through.
was half a Boulez piece,
Yes.
I suppose.